Well, hello everyone. Thanks for joining us today in our new session in the series uh, Community in the Workplace. We are in the second phase of this series, which is our exercise to try to overview what is actually going on, what are the problems that we encounter in the museum field today as regarding professional fulfilling careers from you all and many more. And today we are so very fortunate to have Micah Parzen with us, who is the CEO of the Museum of Us from all of us. He has been working on similar topics for a couple of weeks or months now and organizing webinars with several uh, groups of museum people in preparation of an IMLS grant that he is submitting in that area. And so the way this is going to work today is that we want to have Micah giving a presentation of what he has learned over these very important webinars in preparation of that grant. And then after that, we will have enough time for have a large conversation with you because we hope you have a lot to contribute to that as well. Unfortunately, we can only do it through the chat, so we invite you to make comments and questions through the chat. After the presentation, Micah is going to have two specific questions that he's going to ask you to respond to, so that will guide the conversation at some point. And at the end, we will still have a Q&A just to address maybe things that we have been missing over time. You know that this is recorded. You have seen this, so we will share this recording uh, afterwards with everyone. We will not share the chat because we want you to make sure that if you have things to say, that you feel comfortable saying them and that it will not be shared with too many people. So, so without further ado, Micah, I know you're ready. So take it away from here.
Wonderful. Thanks so much, Walter. Let me just share my screen here. Hopefully everybody's seeing that. I'm seeing it on my screen, so I'm going to assume we're good here. Really, really happy to be here today. Thank you so much, everybody, for being here. Thank you to Museum Expert and especially Walter and Colleen. Really appreciate the opportunity to share today. And we've got about 75 minutes or so together, and really thrilled to be able to talk about what I think is the single most important challenge in the museum field regarding our sustainability. And that is, how do we create internal cultures that are consistent with the beautiful missions and visions and promise of what our institutions can be. I wanted to start by really thanking all of you. This is the pat yourself on the back slide, and it really is an indication of being here today. It says a lot about you as a person. It says that you care very much about your team. You care very much about the workplace context within which you and others show up every day. And you care very much about your organization as well. There are so many things competing for our time today that just being here today says so much and gives me so much hope about the future of our field. So thank you so much. I want to give you a sense of what to expect over the next 75 minutes or so together. I want to talk a little bit about why now. Clearly, a human-centered workplace turn is long overdue in the museum field, but we're also in a bit of a moment of sorts, and that gives us an opportunity to really sort of do better as we know better. So we'll talk a little bit about that. In addition, we'll talk about what a human-centered workplace culture actually looks like. I will share some specific examples from the Museum of Us in terms of the work we've been doing in this space, in the hopes that those may really encourage you to think about what might be applicable within your own workplace context. And We'll also have a couple prompts that really give you the opportunity to share uh, some of the aspects of your organizations or organizations you'd like to work for in terms of the type of human-centered workplaces that they are creating, as well as challenges and obstacles that folks are facing in the field. It's really meant to be an opportunity to co-learn together. Many institutions are experimenting with this kind of work and making good progress, whether it's full-blown policy changes or subtle shifts in their practice and the ways in which their cultures are evolving. And although this isn't the ideal platform to kind of go deep with each other, we really have a great opportunity to still learn from what each other are doing, so we are not reinventing the wheel over and over again. And then we'll talk a little bit about sort of getting started. We've talked about some examples and what that looks like and what a human-centered workplace culture can be and the benefits. But what does that sort of mean on the ground in terms of moving forward? I wanted to also give a little bit of background context on what drew me into this work. I have been the CEO of the Museum of Us for the past 14 years come August. And had never worked a day in a museum when I took the job. And although that was challenging in many ways, it also was a bit of a superpower in that I didn't have a lot of preconceptions about museums and who they were for and the role they could play in the community. I came to the museum with a PhD in anthropology, having been very much trained in human-centered work, but I also was an employment attorney. And I practiced employment law in a big law firm here in San Diego for many years. And I must have drafted hundreds, if not thousands of policies and handbooks for clients in the corporate and nonprofit sphere. And one of the things I really learned through that experience was that those policies and procedures are really not designed to cultivate healthy, functional workplace cultures. They are very much geared toward protecting the employer in the event of a litigation or a claim of some kind, and are sort of designed to kind of CYA for the employer. And in fact, many times they are counterproductive to creating healthy cultures, that they create this sort of us versus them mentality, which ends up ironically leading to the very types of claims and lawsuits that all of us seek to avoid. This really informs how I approach this work, how I've approached our very concerted focus on workplace culture at the Museum of Us over the last many years, and a lot of wonderful things that have flown from that, that I think really is a potentially of benefit to all institutions out there. When we think about this big question of why now, clearly there has been a cumulative neglect of our most important resource, our human resources, in the museum field. And I think we're sort of in a moment now where this has caught up to us in many ways. And we see evidence of these challenges all around us. For those of you who are familiar with the website, the Instagram site, Change the Museum, you know that it is a platform, particularly for BIPOC museum professionals, to share many of the atrocities and horrible, shameful things that happen to them in the workplace. And I think there are something like 900 posts, over 50,000 followers on Change the Museum, and a very important voice in our field to show the inequity, particularly in terms of forward-facing staff, and that so many organizations are sort of talking the talk of equity and inclusion, but so few are actually walking that talk in really meaningful ways. Museum Workers Speak is another sort of platform that you folks may be familiar with. And in particular, they have long spoke out against these huge disparities in pay between the highest paid employees and the lowest paid employees, and really made the case for finding more equitable pay structures within our institutions. Similarly, We all know that we're in the midst of a great resignation. It doesn't really matter the field so much. Many nonprofits are suffering in particular. I've read studies that have indicated that as many as half of our colleagues in the museum field intend to leave within the next 2 to 3 years. And we also, of course, are experiencing a huge upsurge in unionization in the museum field. Um, I believe that approximately 13% of museums now across the country are unionized, with those numbers only increasing. Of course, being another way that people are sort of, putting these issues that are so problematic front and center. Either they're leaving with their feet, or they're voting to band together with unions to try to make sure that their needs in the workplace are not falling on deaf ears by leadership. All of this really is about leading to sort of a death by 1,000 cuts. And sometimes we don't even realize it, but we have this process where we spend so much time recruiting folks and training them and getting them oriented. And then they often leave our institutions, and we have to sort of start that process all over again. So our teams are never really able to get to the point where they're firing on all pistons. And we kind of end up on this treadmill of mediocrity as a result. So all these factors are looming large for all of us. I'm sure whether you're leading an organization on a leadership team, a forward-facing staff member, or anywhere in between, you're kind of grappling with these issues in one way or another. We are in this sort of moment, though, and I think if we trace it back to the pandemic, it makes a lot of sense. I'm not sure if anybody else is familiar with this article, but I think it was in April of 2020, very soon after the pandemic hit, and very soon after most of our museums had to close in mid-March for an unspecified period of time that ended up being upwards of a year. There was an article in the Financial Times by a woman named Arundhati Roy, and it kind of really took my breath away at a time when I needed that to happen most. The title of the article was "The Pandemic is a Portal." And in that article, Roy wrote that in the midst of all this pain and suffering and horror that is going on during this pandemic, we also have an amazing opportunity, and that is to sort of shed these challenges that are so encumbering to us, and somehow find a path to emerge as a better version of ourselves. And at the Museum of Us, we really took that to heart, and we really focused post-pandemic rebuilding our team from the people up, and started making very different types of decisions along those lines. And I think we're not the only ones. There are many museums who have been sort of heeding that call. What does it look like to be a better version of ourselves? How do we know better so we can do better, as Maya Angelou says? And they've been experimenting with some really interesting human-centered approaches to retaining and engaging their teams. And I think we've sort of had to, right? Not only the pandemic forced us to find new ways of really keeping our employees in the mix of the work in really meaningful ways, but we also had the murder of George Floyd, upon murder, of course, that led to a social justice turn where leadership in museums began to really think long and hard about some of the issues that were being raised by Change the Museum and other types of movements that are really challenging us to build more equitable and inclusive museums. So if we think about kind of where we're at, and that there are some experiments and lots of good things going on in this space that are suggesting that we may be able to eventually hit a tipping point where human-centered workplaces are the norm in museums instead of the exception, and continuing to build momentum in that kind of way. Let's talk a little bit about what a human-centered workplace culture can look like. And of course, this applies to our field, the museum industry, but I think it applies to not just any other nonprofit, but even corporate entities where workplace culture is becoming more and more important in terms of leadership and sustainability, particularly as younger generations of workers enter into the workforce and are demanding more from their organizations, are demanding them to be values-based in all sorts of important and meaningful ways. So yes, we're talking about the museum field, but it's very much applicable, I think, to other workplace contexts as well. So if we think about what a human-centered workplace culture looks like, it's important to, I think, start in the realm that this is really a continuum. It is a process, a kind of a space where team members' experiences are really put front and center. And it's not one action, but rather a multitude of actions and decisions that repeatedly send the message to employees that we care about you, that we truly value you and we appreciate you. And I think most importantly, that we want you to bring your whole self to work. We want you to bring your whole self to work because we understand that when you do that, you also bring your most passionate self to work, and you also bring your most productive self to work. And you are able to sort of tap into the unique genius that you bring based on your lived experience and skill sets and what makes you uniquely you. And we can only do that if we provide a sort of context where you feel safe to do that. Of course, the continuum is also sort of a two-way street, right? It's a human-centered workplace culture is one where your employer shows up for you in all these kinds of ways. And in turn, as an employee, you show up for your employer. You realize that this isn't, this is a business that's being run. It may have a triple bottom line in a field like ours, but it's a two-way street where there's a mutual appreciation and a gratitude for the work that's being done. Also important to realize that human-centered workplace cultures are nonlinear. We often have this sort of misguided idea that, moving culture forward is a matter of getting from point A to B, and the best way to approach that is to go a straight line. In fact, human-centered work is very iterative. It is a kind of a long arc, right, of learning and adapting and doing better, and then starting all over again and learning, adapting, and doing better again as you continue to work together with your team to really center their voices and lived experience. All human-centered workplace cultures, however, have certain key characteristics. And I think the most important sort of place to start is really, they are characterized by trust. Usually that trust comes as a result of a willingness by leaders to be transparent about their decision-making processes, about their budgets, about why they're doing what they're doing, and also a real earnestness in actually doing better in terms of putting people first and playing the long game. When you create that kind of trust-based kind of context, people start to share honestly how they're feeling, which is really the key to better understanding. Many workplace cultures feel toxic. They feel ripe with retaliation when people are honest. And there has to be sort of a seeding of the ground and beginning to build that trust so that you can really hear how people are feeling, where the organization is getting it right and where they're not getting it right, and how they can do better. And then really following up with a very deep listening in terms of what that understanding out of curiosity, not deep listening to, or not listening to respond or rebut, but rather really listening out of curiosity and a desire to do better, and bringing in a sort of yes and thinking that is so valuable in terms of approaching this kind of work, of really, trying to start from the departure point of, yes, we can figure this out and we can work together. And we have other things we have to consider too. So let's find what that path looks like together. I think a key characteristic of human-centered workplace cultures is also pain point identification. And again, this builds on the trust and the honest sharing, that these are the ways we're struggling. This is like any relationship you have, a marriage, a friend, a sibling. There are times when things get sort of difficult. And unless there's a willingness to sort of go the courageous path of truth telling, we don't ever know where we're coming up short and how we can do better. So identifying those pain points and then really beginning to approach it as a partnership. So this isn't an us versus them, management versus forward-facing staff or other group team members, but rather a collaborative effort where people are really coming together, and especially the folks who are closest to the problem, right? Who have identified it, who have been vulnerable to some extent in terms of sharing what they're struggling with, and collaboratively coming together to say, hey, let's involve you in developing the solution since you're closest to it. And I think this issue of concrete actions is probably the most important of all, right? You can listen all you want, you can identify all you want, you can talk all you want, but at the end of the day, if you're not taking concrete actions to sort of try things that can improve the workplace experience for folks, really centering their voice and lived experience, it is all just talk. Concrete actions are critically important, even if they're not the be-all end-all solution. What we found at the Museum of Us, and I think the research really supports this, is that there is this sort of amazing virtuous cycle of benefits that emerges when folks begin to engage in much more human-centered workplace culture practices and policies. First off, I think we all know that the more inputs we have around the table, the more lived experience, the more skill sets and different perspectives we have when we're confronting complex situations, the better decisions that we're able to make because we have more data points to incorporate into that process. When we make better decisions as a team and we engage our team members in the work that we are doing in meaningful ways, we find increased retention rates emerge out of that. And we certainly have had this experience at the Museum of Us. This has led to stronger teams and healthier cultures because you're sort of avoiding that death by a thousand cuts. You are transcending this idea that you are constantly having to recruit and train and orient folks and then do the whole process all over again, so that your team can really fire on all pistons. And your projects don't experience this stop-start sort of phenomenon, and you can really make wonderful progress. So, this will lead to improved recruitment efforts as well. People want to work for organizations that really treat their employees well, that really care about them, that truly value them. And, the higher quality team members you can recruit, again, it sort of reinforces the strength of the team, the healthiness of the culture, and even better decisions are made. Another important factor, I think, is that the visitor experience improves. And I often think about this research about the hospitals with the highest satisfaction rates and really studying what contributes to that. And the research indicating that the most important factor is the happiness quotient of the nurses. And the reason for that, of course, is that it's really the nurses who are engaging with the patients. They're the ones who are tending and caring for them. And the more that they are, the happier that they are in the workplace, the more engaged they are, the better care they give, the more connected they are to those patients. They develop relationships that are really meaningful, that have an impact on the healing process. And of course, patients remember that. And so when they fill out their surveys or are interviewed, they evidence very high patient satisfaction rates. And all this, of course, leads to the conclusion that our bottom line improves. So in many ways, yes, this is morally and ethically the path to go in terms of really centering the voice and the lived experience of our teams in ways that treat people as if they're valued and respected and really sort of care for them. But it's also good business, right? Because it leads to this sort of virtuous cycle that ends up really helping our bottom line in all sorts of ways. I wanted to share a little bit about equity and the relationship between equity and this sort of human-centered work, because I think while it may not be obvious on its face, the two are really inextricably interlinked. And I would say that because, of course, we live in this sort of white, normative world, right? Where most of our human resources and workplace culture policies and practices are sort of emerging out of that white normative world. It is sort of the air we breathe, it's the water we swim in, and we don't often even notice that that's the case. But when we start to really identify those pain points, particularly of our BIPOC team members, who are struggling with that white normative context, we begin to learn things about when we center their voice and lived experience, ways in which we're really coming up short. And when you engage in human-centered work of this nature, you begin to center different kinds of voices and different types of lived experience. So these kinds of questions about where we're coming up short inevitably lead to beginning to address some of the kinds of challenges that are posed to leadership on platforms such as Change the Museum and others. So the two can't be really disconnected, and to the extent that one goes down the human-centered workplace culture route, you will begin to, by definition, really start to grapple with issues of equity, which again are sort of long overdue in the field. I wanted to share a little bit about some specific examples about what human-centered workplace approaches can look like, and contrast them with sort of the traditional approaches. These are all examples from the Museum of Us, and different types of shifts or policy changes that we have engaged in over the last, I'd say 2 to 3 years, if not longer. The first one I wanted to talk about has to do with pay equity, which is clearly one of the most vexing aspects of the museum field at the moment. A lot of blogs and articles written about this. This is something that we just sort of need to address. Former Labor Secretary Robert Reich is known for saying that, if you can't afford to pay your employees a living wage, then your business model is broke, essentially, that you shouldn't exist if you can't begin to build an organization from the people up. And I think he's exactly right. And it's just a matter of time before more and more museums, which are used to paying minimum wage, a little bit above minimum wage, and particularly in a market like San Diego or San Francisco or New York or Chicago, is woefully under the living wage that is required to avoid, juggling 3 jobs just to sort of make ends meet. So at the Museum of Us, this was a really important sort of beginning point for us. And in particular, after the pandemic and we were able to reopen, we decided to rehire folks in a much different way. Like many of our institutions, we had started or long had a wage a little bit above minimum wage. I think it was $13 or $13.50 in California at the time. It's since gone up, but we were, I think, $1 above that in an effort to kind of be competitive. We had a whole pool of part-time employees who didn't have benefits. And when we reopened with the pandemic, we decided to take a very different approach. We started by only rehiring full-time employees, and we paid them a wage of $20 an hour. So everybody was fully benefited when they came back on board, a very different model. We had 5% annual pay COLA increases, cost of living adjustments, that were baked in for a period of 3 years, so that folks are now entering the organization at $23 an hour, a little bit above that. We also had a 6% retirement contribution, and we decided to add a salary cap between the amount that the highest paid employee, namely me, and the lowest paid employee, namely our forward-facing staff, could make. So that is now 6 to 1. So I can't make more than 6 times our lowest paid employee. The idea being that if I want to make more money, we have to uplift everybody in the organization, and we have to start with the folks that make the least in order to honor that cap. And this has led to amazing retention rates at the museum, higher engagement rates. I think we know that pay isn't the only reason that people stay at organizations. We know toxic supervisors are the main reasons that people leave, but it is an important factor. And I think, making sure that people feel that there's a fair exchange between the labor that they are giving and the pay and the benefit and the supports they are receiving is obviously a critically important factor. And it's paid off at the museum in all sorts of wonderful ways. I also wanted to share a different kind of policy. We all have sort of or most of us at least have traditional holidays at the Museum of Us. We, I think, had 14 different holidays. And, that's pretty standard, and employees can take those days off. Well, we started to kind of rethink that approach because some of our BIPOC team members in particular came to us and they said that while they very much appreciate the holidays that we afford to employees, many of the holidays that we offered, which were sort of the standard ones, weren't days that they necessarily wanted to celebrate. They weren't days that were meaningful to them. They came from a colonial, patriarchal sort of context, whether it's Thanksgiving or Christmas or New Year's or President's Day, whatever the case may be. These just weren't days that they wanted to take off and celebrate. And so we brought folks in, we problem solved together, we brainstormed a variety of possibilities, and we ended up coming up with a solution in this new policy we called Holidays for All. Holidays for All essentially allows employees to take our museum designated holidays, which are still sort of more or less the usual suspects, and substitute one or more of them for employee designated holidays. So if you want to take all 14 holidays during a certain time of the year that is important to you for whatever reason, no questions asked, you can swap those out. And it has been really successful. It's been challenging in many ways from the scheduling front, and that has been an issue that we've had to sort of apply some serious yes and thinking to. But what's important is that it really has given our team members agency in deciding, rather than the museum dictating, you must take these days off because this is what we've designated. It says you can take those off if you want, but if not, you have the freedom to flexibly apply however you want. And again, it's kind of on a no questions asked basis. Similarly, we had a situation where, again, I think because we had created a kind of underlying context of trust and a willingness to share pain points, we had some of our Indigenous employees come to us and share that they were going to ceremony at a certain time, and that they would need to be gone for 3 days. And that when they were going to ceremony, they weren't sick, and they weren't going on vacation. They were doing the hard work of building and supporting their communities. Could we have time off for that? And, you know, a traditional approach would just say, no, you have other aspects. You can take the unpaid leave. Certainly, if you ask your attorney, they would, you know, say, well, there are other mechanisms for doing that. And instead, we really sort of engaged in that deep listening process. And the more we talked about it, the more we thought, wow, what a wonderful opportunity that would be for not just our Indigenous employees, but for all of our employees to have paid time off to build and support community, however they might define it. So we came up with a new policy. We called it community-centered leave, and every employee at the Museum of Us gets 3 days of paid community-centered leave every year. There are, of course, certain sort of requirements. You have to give sufficient notice and work around your scheduling issues, but you can use it however you want to, essentially, to define, to build and support community. So if you're going to ceremony, wonderful. If you want to go on a backpacking trip, that's up to you. If you want to go on a yoga retreat, by all means. You know, we're in San Diego, not too far from Disneyland. If going to Disneyland is how you build and support community, we support that. There are no questions asked. We simply say, we hope you will use this for that purpose to build and support community, however you define it. Again, really well received by our team, emerging out of their you know, pain points and requests, and taking those seriously, and really partnering with them to come up with solutions that are viable and can really help them bring their whole selves to work, take time off when they need it with agency in sort of the ways they need it. Another example I wanted to share is the idea of interview pay. And this is something kind of hot off the presses for us at the Museum of Us. We have been kind of grappling with this issue for a while, and we decided we would try this. And I think it's worth noting that with all of these policies, we always have a beta testing period. So we are coming up with a solution that we think is viable. We continue to iterate on it. We sort of check in to see how it's going, and you know, we pivot as necessary. But with respect to this particular new policy, we recently were hiring for a new director of decolonizing initiatives. And we had interviewed a whole slew of applicants, and we narrowed down the field to four semifinalists who we were going to ask to engage in a pretty comprehensive process of 2 one-hour interviews with 2 different panels. And we knew that particularly at this sort of stage in the game, the folks that we were interviewing were all Indigenous folks. They were all bringing a certain lived experience and wisdom and expertise. And we knew that during the interview process, we were going to get a lot of ideas and benefit significantly from that input that they would provide, whether they ended up getting hired or not, or moving on to the next round. And so we decided, as sort of a thank you and an appreciation for their contribution to the discussion during those interviews, we would pay each of them $200 as part of that semifinal process. It was a big success, as you can imagine. Folks were thrilled, and everyone we interviewed said, wow, this is so meaningful, a really wonderful example of you folks walking the talk, and only makes me want to work for you even more. It built a huge amount of goodwill, I think, whether the person ended up getting the job or not. You know, they became fans of our work, and you know, I think they really felt honored that their lived experience and their skill sets and what they uniquely brought to the table was at least being sort of recognized in that way. Whether we'll continue to do that, I'm not sure. This was sort of an interesting, a unique kind of job opportunity, and required, again, us bringing Indigenous folks into the mix, and really we wanted to kind of honor them based on our decolonial work. So we'll continue to think about that. The last policy I wanted to share that might sound a little counterintuitive in some ways. And that is a trustee reimbursement policy. It kind of sounds odd, I think, because most of us come from institutions where our trustees are brought on because of their financial wherewithal, because of their philanthropic ability to write a check to the museum. And that is very much a expectation of why they're on the board. They are, the idea is that they can and should pay their own way. They should be giving to the organization in all sorts of ways, financially, the time, treasure, and talent. But they also should, if there's any board-related activities, they should pay their own way there. And at the Museum of Us, yes, we have philanthropists on our board who are helping us, engage in the work through their financial support. And we also have brought on folks who are very differently positioned along the economic spectrum. And it's a stretch for them not only to contribute, and we just have we don't care if you give $1 or $1 million, as long as you're giving, that's what's important. So some folks just can't attend all of our events. We also have some national trustees now. We have folks in DC and Chicago and Denver, and it's expensive to come, right? We're bringing on folks in New York and some other places too to sort of expand our board in these types of ways. And so we decided that if we really want to have a board that reflects our community, and is truly diverse in terms of the types of experiences that people are bringing to the table, whether that be from a socioeconomic status or in all sorts of other ways, we need to at least provide a mechanism for those who need it. We passed a policy that applies to all of our Indigenous trustees, because we feel there's something not right about charging or not supporting our Indigenous trustees after all the harm that the museum has done to their communities and others like theirs. We also recognize that some trustees are having to travel long distance, and we also recognize that some trustees can't afford to participate in all the activities without financial support. So every year, and we just started beta testing this policy this year, we've got a trustee can submit receipts for up to $2,000 in reimbursement to allow them to participate in activities that they might not otherwise be able to participate in. Again, it's sort of a no questions asked. If you feel you need it and that the policy applies to you for one of those reasons, we encourage folks to apply. We will kick the tires on that policy in 6 months, particularly as even sooner actually, as we begin to budget. But already I think it's been a wonderful recruiting tool. It shows that we're trying to walk the talk in different kinds of ways along these lines. So we wanted to get you folks involved to the extent we can. I haven't had a chance to look at the chat at all. I'm hopeful that there are some great questions, and Colleen can kind of chime in if there are some things that we want to address now. But I wanted to give you a prompt and hope that folks will begin to talk about some of the things that they're experiencing. In particular, I mentioned all of our organizations are having to find new ways and innovative ways to engage folks and on our teams. And these can take a wide variety of forms. And so we'd love to have you share what is one human-centered workplace shift that your organization has made. You may be in a workplace context where your museum is not making a lot of strides in this particular space. And in that event, I would encourage you to share, what is the kind of workplace that you want to be in? What would it be the type of policy or practice shift that would be meaningful for you? Maybe you don't have a job at all, and you're sort of looking for work, right? If you could imagine your ideal workplace culture in a museum or some other organization, what would that look like? What would you like to see? I've given you some really nice examples, I think, at least of the work that we're doing at the Museum of Us, but I know from talking to colleagues, there are things small, medium, and large that different institutions are engaging in. And the idea here is that we can really benefit from each other sharing. So let's see, Colleen, do you have anything that anybody's sharing that might be a valuable kind of thing for us to talk about a little bit?
Sure, Micah. So in response to this prompt, Avi said, paying all interns, which I think is a pretty excellent point.
Yeah, love it. Thank you for raising that, Avi. You know, it used to be back in the day, right? You know, the internship was unquestionably unpaid. And it was this form of free labor that sometimes was very exploitative because institutions took advantage of that. Other times, there were folks who, you know, got a lot of learning out of it as well. I think the biggest concern, in addition along those lines, though, is that, you know, it's generally only folks who come from sort of privileged, wealthier backgrounds that can afford to sort of work for free in those kinds of ways as part of their professional development. So highly problematic for BIPOC folks who are wanting to learn the museum field and gain the skills necessary that ultimately will help them gather those jobs. So the pipeline of who was sort of eligible for those jobs tended to be mostly white privileged people, right? And perpetuating kind of these types of things. So I'm really thrilled. For one, at the Museum of Us, we always pay for internships. We have for some time. I know there's a movement in the field more generally to think of internships much differently. The laws are also changing a bit to scrutinize that more. And I think, you know, if your institution isn't already paying for internships, they certainly should, in addition to helping the growth of the individual. So thank you for that, Avi. What else is coming up for folks, Colleen?
I thought another really good one was paid coaching services for new managers or those stretching into more senior roles. Seemed like a great point.
Yeah, that is a great point. And that is not something we've done as much of at the museum. I will say that in my role, I have always had an executive coach, and it has been critical to my growth. And I think that's applicable in many ways, no matter where you are in an organization and how you're positioned. I think sometimes the needs are a little different. And thinking about equity and equality, really important to distinguish, right? And that equity is really about asking what is needed in that particular role. And so that might look like executive coaching, particularly for certain employees. It might look like different kinds of investments in professional development, right? At the Museum of Us, we now have a Museums Empowered grant from IMLS, where we're really going deep into these kinds of issues in terms of supporting our forward-facing staff, helping them put tools in their toolbox for de-escalation when they're confronted with sort of ornery visitors and the like. And, you know, these are, I think, discussions we engage in where, unless you're really asking, what are the pain points? What do you need? And maybe it's executive coaching, but maybe it's some other kind of support based on where that person is in their career. Maybe we'll take one or two more, Colleen, and then we can move on to the next prompt.
Sure. Thaddeus just dropped in, which I think this is a great one too. Would like to see more employers helping with transportation needs, bus passes, bike sharing, car sharing, etc.
Yeah, love that one, Thaddeus. Thank you for raising that. You know, I think it's many leaders or leadership teams who make more of a salary and are able to afford a lot of the things that make life easier, whether it's getting to work or staying late at work or making sure that other activities of daily living are addressed, often lives a little bit in a different world from the forward-facing staff and others who are differently positioned in the organization, even if a living wage is paid, right? You know, they're still, they may not be able to drive to work. They may have to bike or transportation or what have you. I know of one institution in Balboa Park in San Diego who, during the beginning of the Russia-Ukrainian war, they were really looking to take care of their forward-facing staff and realizing that gas prices had increased so much. So they gave everybody a gas stipend so that they could sort of take the edge off. So these are all the types of things that really count as human-centered workplace practice shifts. I would also say, however, that it's not just one thing, as I mentioned, it's a multiplicity of actions and decisions that are constantly sending this message that we really care about you and we're trying to support you in ways that we can. Maybe we take one more and then we'll move on to the next prompt.
Sure. Brinta shared that Discovery Museum has intentionally and incrementally been changing some of their part-time positions to full-time with benefits positions.
Nice, nice, excellent. And I hope many of your organizations are doing the same. I mentioned that the Museum of Us had done that, you know, the part-time sort of phenomenon, I think is a real struggle in our field. It tends to create, and the Museum of Us, when it was the San Diego Museum in particular, did this for many years, you know, it tends to be a sort of first class and second class citizens between full-timers and part-timers. Often part-timers who don't have benefits and all the rest or have two or one or two other jobs just to make ends meet. They often can't attend lots of the sort of team building events. They're often sort of kind of siloed in different ways, and they're typically the most disgruntled of the team, right? We found that when we converted all of our part-time positions to full-time positions, the culture started to coalesce in a completely different way and in a much healthier way. And now, you know, 3 years into that, we are starting to ask, well, maybe we could have some part-time positions because scheduling can be so problematic. And what does that look like? And how do we make sure that if we were to create some part-time positions, those folks don't feel like second-class citizens, that they still get benefits, perhaps, that we make sure that we're paying them for any other time or supporting them in other ways so that they really can be integrated into the workplace in healthy ways. So great, thank you all. I'm sure, again, I'm not able to sort of walk and chew gum at the same time relative to really monitoring chat, so appreciate your help, Colleen. I imagine there's some great comments in there, and hopefully we can get to some of those in the Q&A. So let's, looks like I'm frozen here. There we go. So a second prompt is, you know, we know that, yes, there are many of us who are experimenting in these ways. We're centering the lived experience and the voices of our teams and developing different sort of webs to support them and specific practices and policy shifts. But we also know that there are many challenges in the field toward really effectuating this kind of human-centered workplace culture turn. So we'd love to hear from you folks, some of the things that you're seeing in the field. We don't have to attribute it to your own organization necessarily, but some of the primary challenges and hurdles that you are seeing that is really stopping us from kind of wholesale adopting this kind of approach. And as those emerge in the chat, we can begin to talk a little bit about how do we find the path around those potentially. So Colleen, if there's anything we can share that can kind of get that discussion going, we'd love to hear that.
Yeah, there's we've all heard it, but that's not the way we've always done it, or this is the way it's always been done as the excuse for not making changes.
Yeah, right. Oh gosh, I hate that response so much, right? I mean, I love the person who put it in there, but it's like, oh, that thinking is so stilting. It's so defeatist. It's so, you know, and you always have that, right? People are going to resist change and they're going to dig in. And, you know, if we think about where our field is today, all these sort of ailments that are obvious from Museum Workers Speak and Change the Museum and unionization and the Great Resignation, what we are doing is not working, folks. You know, people are really struggling. I mean, there have been some wonderful articles out there recently really wondering if the museum field can continue to survive at this rate, given the ways in which people are leaving the field and the disgruntlement and that some serious shifts have to be made. So, you know, I think that sort of resistance to change can be endemic in any workplace culture. And I will also say that at the Museum of Us, this wasn't something that happened over a short period of time. We have very much been playing the long game. And early on in this process, we faced an enormous amount of resistance. And I think if you just stay the course and keep going this path, eventually people find the door either on their own, or sometimes they have to be nudged in that direction. And you can begin to bring on different types of people who don't have that same sort of mindset that this is the way we've always done it. I don't want to change. It's going to make more work for me, or whatever the case may be. So folks who are facing that, I encourage, just keep plugging away and really think about this as the long game, because that's what it takes. What else, Colleen?
I thought Rita made an excellent point. She said, in her perception, that many museums, were in survival mode for so long that they can't pause long enough now to embrace the opportunity to become a better version of themselves. They're focused, I think she said in the second comment, focused on getting back to normal, air quotes, and not making those changes when they have the opportunity.
Yeah, right. Yeah, it's sort of like, do you hunker down and one of the things that or do you sort of seize on the opportunity? And I think one of the things Arundhati Roy wrote about in that article, The Pandemic is a Portal, which I really encourage you all to read, is that we really need to resist the urge to return to normal. Because if we're honest with ourselves and each other, normal has been pretty messed up, right? And has led to sort of all these challenges. So sometimes the old adage of things have to get worse before they get better, I think we're sort of in that moment. And even though it feels like survival is at stake, it's either at stake now in the short term in getting back to normal, or it's at stake in the long term in terms of our sustainability. So really encouraging folks to kind of resist that urge to go back to normal and to really say, how do we flip the script? How do we do better instead of returning to many of the challenges that we've been facing for so long? Maybe we have one more time for one more challenge or hurdle, Colleen, and then we can move on.
Yeah. So Shelby commented the disconnect between higher ups, I think like senior org chart folks, and those at the lower end of the org chart actually in the trenches doing the daily work and not making sure that policies connect with those folks.
Yeah, I think that is really hits the nail on the head in terms of one of the biggest challenges, right? That this kind of work really requires leadership to, connect with employees throughout the organization in a much different way. Again, sort of beginning with that trust building process, that transparency, that here's how we make decisions and how this decision was made. You may not agree with it, but we at least want you to know kind of what went into it, that your voice really matters in terms of informing those decisions. And we want to bring you to the table. We may not always do what you're asking us to do, but we're going to try to approach it from that yes and thinking. We're going to try to understand what it's like. One of the things we're doing with this IMLS Museums Empowered grant in terms of professional development for our forward-facing staff in particular is sort of starting with a firm that is doing a series of, I think they call them empathy interviews. And it basically says, hey, forward-facing staff, what's the day in a life for you? What are you facing? What are your challenges? What are the low points of your day? What are the high points? Where do you really struggle? And how can the museum sort of better support you? So I think that, moving forward in this space to kind of transcend that disconnect really requires these types of initiatives that try to support the team from their perspective and really hear what they have to say, and then really try to address those in concrete ways. Well, thank you everybody for participating. We'll have some time for questions in a bit, but I just have a little bit more to share relative to sort of great, Micah. So, we realize there's a challenge here. We realize that, this is a path that could really help museums as they continue down the path of sustainability. While we have so many challenges, there's also so much possibility out there. And we know that where there's possibility, there's also hope. And, I think the question then becomes that no matter where you are in a particular organization and where you're positioned, how do you start to do this work? And I would just raise a few points. And first is really going back to setting the stage wherever you are in the organization, finding ways to sort of bloom where you're planted and to help others around you really bloom as well. Wherever you are, working to encourage leadership to cultivate a space of trust and transparency and a real desire to do better, to be open to sort of hearing hard truths about where we're getting it wrong without triggering feelings of defensiveness or being threatened, but rather coming from that vantage point of curiosity. And I think, that's what we really have to kind of move into that pain if we're going to address those pain points in positive and productive ways. And then again, going back to the importance of sort of deep listening to our teams, from that vantage point of curiosity, to really understand what their experience is like, so that we can get to those pain points and bring folks into the mix of being part of the solution development process, which is always iterative when it comes to human-centered work. Thinking back to that continuum, thinking back to that squiggly line that is so nonlinear, is really the idea of trying something, right? Trying it on for size, seeing if it works, figuring out where it does and doesn't, working with others to continue to come up with better and better solutions. And then most importantly, I think it's taking that leap. We're never going to be perfect. It's easy to spin your wheels on human-centered work. At some point, you have to just kind of go for it. And then, as I said, you can beta test, right? You want to go into it in a thoughtful and intentional way. But your team has to see concrete actions. They have to know that you're listening, you're learning, you're trying to do better. And if you get it wrong, you can evaluate and adapt accordingly. I'll share a resource that has been phenomenal in our work. It's something we're using now. There's this amazing sort of guidebook. It's called the Anti-Racist HR Guidebook. And it's not so much a employee handbook as how to create an anti-racist employee handbook. So a group of educators and learners came together from various expertise and kind of gave this step-by-step for how to create a very different type of employee handbook that, while it isn't explicitly human-centered, it is explicitly anti-racist and taps into BIPOC voice and lived experience in ways that really help us rethink the white normative experience that this sort of experience that dominates. So a wonderful resource. I encourage you to check it out. You can buy it online. I think it's about $150, and it is worth the money over and over again. I also wanted to share briefly a project in the works, and then we can open it up to some questions, whatever might have been coming up in the remaining time we have. The Museum of Us, as Walter has indicated in the beginning, recently applied for a IMLS National Leadership Grant based on this premise that sharing our human-centered workplace practices can uplift us all. And the goal of the project is really to catalyze this kind of human-centered workplace turn in the museum field that's so long overdue and so needed for us to sort of cultivate sustainable institutions going forward. So the idea here, if we were to get the grant, and we should find out in August, is that we will identify a cohort of 10 museum influencers, institutions, and their leaders who are already leaning in human-centered ways in terms of workplace practices, and can really do deeper dives to continue to go down the path and develop a strategic action plan for this type of work, and continue to make progress in this space, and then create a series of webinars, not unlike this one, that would bring people together who are really doing these deep dives and have made progress, to share what that's looking like from their particular organization's vantage point, some of the challenges they face, the successes they've had. I've shared today what the Museum of Us has been doing, but everybody's sort of on their own journey, right? And they've been kind of grappling with different challenges and had different successes. So how can we learn from each other along those lines? So hopefully we'll get that grant, fingers crossed. We can use all the good luck coming our way. We should find out in August. And the idea is we would give those 10 museums, develop a tool. Maybe it's an LMS, maybe it's some sort of an annotated employee handbook that sort of, helps you continue down a human-centered workplace culture path. It sort of remains to be seen depending on the discussions that would happen with the cohort. But we hope to build critical mass in this space. I imagine that by you all being here, you're already sort of sold on this type of work. You want to see more of it in the field. And if anyone's interested, please do reach out to me, and we can talk more about what it might look like to involve you or your institution. I also wanted to share that if any of you are going to be in Baltimore at AAM in May, we will be presenting a sort of version of this. We're going to do a deep dive into pay equity, in particular, a 20-minute flash session with my my executive director, Aaron Spiewak, who really was the architect of our pay equity policies at the museum. So I hope you'll join us and would love to continue these discussions. We have a few minutes left, I think, Colleen, and I'll defer to you as to how much time we have and any questions that you think would be nice to address for folks.
Sure, I will come back on camera so you're not talking into the ether. Had a couple of really good ones come in. I think we have time for maybe 2 or 3, and I know that there were a lot in the chat, but I'm going to try to pick out some of the top ones. I think it was Thaddeus, and I apologize if I'm incorrect, asked early on in our chat, how do you quantify the improvements in the bottom line as a result of having made these human-centered changes? For those data monsters, for those numbers folks, how do you quantify that?
Yeah, gosh, Thaddeus, I wish I had a really good answer for that just blew your socks off, but unfortunately I don't. It's one of those things that I think you know it when you see it, and while that's not particularly satisfying, I think for some, especially our more quantitative kind of wonks out there, there is an energy that emerges, when you start to shift in these kinds of ways. And I think, it's important to have folks who really get that, both on the team and also on the board, right? Because the board will be asking questions along those lines and looking for answers that they can kind of put into their quantitative machines and say, yes, this is working. We certainly have tools, employee satisfaction and engagement surveys and those kinds of things, retention numbers. But it's also, I think, when you're approaching it from a human-centered point of view, some of those numbers aren't really as meaningful as you might think. So, we're a fairly small institution at the Museum of Us. And while we always try to promote folks from within whenever that makes sense, and we really encourage folks in that kind of way, sometimes they've just sort of tapped out and they need another platform to continue down their path. And so we celebrate when somebody leaves, even though that negatively impacts our retention numbers. We know that we've done everything we can to support them in the ways that we can, but they need something else at this point, and that's okay. So, we're always looking for new tools. If anyone has any, I'd love to hear more. But I would also caution, when you know it, when you see it, and it is deeply satisfying because you see that your organization is just functioning in a different kind of way.
Micah, could you expand a little bit on some of your part-time staff? We had some folks who were asking about, how many of these benefits apply to those people who are part-time, and how, where was it? Sorry about that. Like the community-centered leave specifically, and, holidays for all. How do you work that in with your part-time staff?
Yeah, so right now we don't have any part-time staff. We might have one that sort of is very, very part-time, and they're in a little bit of a different category. And they help with events, I think, that kind of thing on occasion. more like an independent contractor. But everybody on the team gets the full panoply of benefits. And that's kind of what we're grappling with, right? If we bring on somebody part-time, does that still apply as the case? And, we're very much leaning towards yes, it does, because we want to support that person. We already provide that. Yes, they're part-time, but we don't want them to really experience that second-class status. So that's one of the challenges we have relative to, do we create some part-time positions to help ease some of the scheduling burdens. But I think that given the work we do, we probably will grant those folks any benefit that any part-time employee, any full-time employee would get as well.
Great. Well, I think at this point, we're going to go ahead and wrap it up. We really thank you for your time, Micah. I'm going to invite Walter to come back on and just give us some parting thoughts. But we're so grateful for everything that Museum of Us has been doing, your time with us today, and sharing your thoughts and expertise and what has worked and what hasn't. So thank you very much.
My pleasure. Thank you so much for having me.
Walter, do I have you ready to come back on? Maybe not. Oh, there he is. Great.
I'm here. Yeah, well, thanks, Micah, as well for this presentation. We wanted something solid to introduce and to start a conversation, and obviously that it's worked, because we had a lot of reaction in the chat that we could not possibly really react to within the frame of this thing. But hopefully, in the future, for those who follow us regularly and for the others, this is part of a series, and your second prompt actually is a good segue to what our next conversation is going to be. You call them, what are the challenges to implement like a human-centered workplace in your organization? We call them barriers. What are the barriers that actually prevent the creation of such a culture in your institution? And so we are thinking amongst ourselves, how are we going to handle that? How are we going to start this conversation? So if anyone out there is following us and has ideas, we're happy to listen to them and involve them in the conversation for the preparation of that event. So that is the next. That will be in March. You will find that you will get the information in time for that. So thanks again, Micah. Thanks, Colleen, for doing all the work behind the scenes and the questions and all of that, and the whole team of the PM Expert who have been, of course, doing the promotion and all the rest to make this a success today. So thank you again. Thank you all for being here, and I see you next.